So this week we're going to be shifting our attention to philosophy of time, specifically considerations. In fact, we'll be focusing on time for the rest of term now. What's gone before will, however, be relevant because we're going to look at metaphysical theories of time, but we're going to be paying attention, among other things, to how contemporary physical theorizing bears upon our metaphysics of time. So we'll consider a little bit this week how special relativity bears upon that metaphysics. That will be considered in more detail next week. And then when we talk about time travel, consideration again of general relativity is going to become relevant. But for the most part, this week's going to be a sort of more straightforward run through of the metaphysics background to the philosophy of time. Some of you who've taken second year metaphysics, the module I teach, will have covered some of the aspects of this topic already. If so, just bear with me. If not, don't worry. You'll get introduced to everything relevant this week. Okay, so I'm just going to switch to the handout now. So topic metaphysics of time. So why focus on time as opposed to sort of, I mean, we considered space, and it was natural when we were looking through the lens of something like Newtonian mechanics to focus exclusively on space. So Newtonian mechanics supposes three-dimensional Euclidean space, and then the idea is when we think about space-time, essentially we just have a series of states of that space over time. So the space itself retains its identity over time, but obviously objects move about within it. Then as we started to look at Galilean space-time, Minkowski space-time, obviously we incorporated some considerations not just of space but of time, and now we're focusing more purely on time. So why would you sort of abstract considerations of time from those of space, given that contemporary theories describe something called space-time? Well, we won't entirely abstract from considerations of contemporary physics, as I just said. However, there is something kind of interesting about time, or at least it appears there's something interesting about time that makes it somewhat different from space. So, obviously, Minkowski's space-time, the t-axis is one among four axes in a Lorentz coordinate system. So that is generally treated as representing time. But so you might think, well, great, it's one axis among four. What's so special about this one? Well, I mean, I guess it functions slightly differently in Minkowski space-time than the other axes. So if you think about the role in the interval measure, time plays a different role to the spatial dimension. So interval is increasing in time, or increasing along the t-axis, but decreasing along the spatial axes. So there is some difference even in Minkowski space-time. And for instance, we get the phenomenon, relatedly, we get the phenomenon of time dilation, whereas we have length contraction. So a sort of disanalogy between time and space. Thinking more broadly, it seems that our experience of time is somewhat different from our experience of space. So We tend to think, just in our ordinary thought and talk, and maybe perception of time as having a privileged direction. So we think that there's a significant difference between past and future. Nothing analogous seems to be the case for space, right? So, of course, we can talk about what's east of here or west of here or up from here or down from here. But I don't think we ordinarily think of these as any direction as privileged or particularly different from the other in any fundamental respect. So these tend to just be distinctions that we make based on where we're located. We don't think there's any sort of physically or metaphysically privileged status to, say, east of here, in the way that there might be something very different about the past to the future. Also, and perhaps relatedly, we tend to think of time as flowing or passing. So, I guess you get the kind of river metaphor sometimes. So the river of time, the passage of time. So, this seems to be, again, part of our ordinary experience. So it seems to us as though time passes. We might even say that, it feels to us that time has passed quickly. Time flies when you're having fun, or maybe it drags when you're bored. So at least subjectively, we seem to have an experience of flow. Now, when it comes to space, there doesn't seem to be anything particularly analogous. So we don't ordinarily talk about space as flowing or passing in the way that time flows or passes. So this raises some interesting philosophical questions about time. So what is it, if anything, that accounts for the direction of time and the apparent flow of time? Interestingly, it's rather hard to find anything in physics that implies a flow of time. So this phenomenon, this appearance at least, of flow is pretty puzzling. There are other questions we might ask about time. So could there be time without change? Could there be a period of time in which absolutely no events occurred? This question's at least somewhat analogous to the question about whether there could be space without objects in it. So just as we might regard space as absolute, so potentially existing without objects, or we might think of it as relational, so constituted by the relations between objects. You might ask a similar question about time. So is time a container which could exist even without any events in it? Or is change, that is the events within time, somehow essential to its nature? Other questions. So given that there seems to be an asymmetry between past and future, we might wonder whether one or both exist in the same sense that the present exists. So obviously, maybe connected to the flow of time, we tend to think of there's something sort of special about the present, right? So certainly we seem to have a sort of special or immediate access epistemically to the present. At least naively, we might think we see things going on in the present, whereas we don't as straightforwardly observe the distant past or the future. So the question is, does that correspond to anything of ontological significance? Is there a metaphysical difference between present and past and future? Another question, which we'll be addressing later in term, is time travel possible? So obviously, most of us will have come across fictional time travel stories about people going back to visit the dinosaurs, or going forwards in time to visit maybe distant human Martian outposts. I guess there's a question about whether that's possible, or but there's also a more general question about whether any form of time travel is possible. So even if that were limited, say, to backwards in time traveling particles, so some physicists have posited tachyons, which are supposed to be backwards in time traveling particles. Is that possible? So yeah, as I say, we'll see that general relativity and special relativity seem to have some implications for some of these debates, and we'll touch upon those as we go. But there's a fairly kind of important metaphysical argument that it's going to be quite important to understand in order to make progress with some of these questions, because this argument, due to Mctaggart, given at the beginning of the 20th century, has really helped to shape metaphysical debate over time ever since. So Mctaggart famously argued that time is unreal, which is a surprising conclusion. And maybe that's one of the reasons it's generated so much attention. So it's fair to say that not many people accept the conclusion of his argument that time's unreal. But people are divided about how to resist his argument, because his argument, at least has some prima facie credibility to it. So it's, not obvious how to overcome it. Different philosophers choose different ways of overcoming it, rejecting different premises. And this has essentially led to a range of positions in the philosophy of time being defined. So it's important as background to understand Mctaggart's argument, and it's interesting in its own right. So Mctaggart starts by claiming that events in time can be distinguished in two ways. So he says we can distinguish them according to what he calls their A properties. So that's just a technical term of his, A property. The A properties, according to him, are properties like being past, being present, being future. Also maybe sort of finer grained properties like being 2 days past, being 20 years future. Those are A properties. On the other hand, he says we can distinguish events in time according to what he calls their B relations. So B relations are relations like is earlier than, X is earlier than Y, or Y is later than X. Or maybe W is simultaneous with Z. Or maybe A is during B. So these relations, earlier than, later than, is simultaneous with, is during. These are B relations, according to Mctaggart. Now, Mctaggart points out that B relations are permanent. So if one event is earlier than another, then it's always the case that the first event is earlier than the second. So if World War II is later than World War One, that's always going to be the case, right? So it's not the case that, for a while World War II is later than World War One, and then, at some point it flips so that World War II is actually earlier than World War One. The B relations are permanent. If they hold at one time, they hold at all times. On the other hand, Mctaggart says the A properties are impermanent. So whether an event is past, present, or future is a changeable matter. So, for instance, World War II was future prior to 1939. It was present during 1939 to 1945, and it's been past and will be past from 1945 onwards. Now, Mctaggart suggests that corresponding to the A properties and the B relations, there are two ways to order events in time. So we can order events according to their A properties, so how distantly past they are, whether they're present, and how distantly future they are. So we just put them in order of from most distant past through to most distant future. We could also order them according to their B relations. So according to whether they're earlier than or later than others. So if there are a first moment in time, then maybe there are events that are earlier than all others, and they'd, I guess, go first in the order. If there were a last moment in time, then there would be events that occurred later than all others, and they'd go at the end of the order. And then you'd basically sort out the ones in between according to how they relate to those and how they relate to each other. If time's infinite, then nevertheless we can still order the events. It's just that the order is going to be non-finite. There's no first or last events in the order. So you might, obviously we'd expect the order to be the same, right? So the ordering according to the A properties would expect to result in the same order as ordering events according to their B relations. So ordering them according to how distantly past they are will result in the same order as ordering according to earlier and later than. But nevertheless, Mctaggart has terms for these. So, they're sort of two different ways of ordering events, even if the order that's produced is ultimately the same. So, Mctaggart calls the first of these orderings the so-called A series, and the second of these orderings he calls the B series. Okay, so that's the background we need in order to understand Mctaggart's argument. So the Mctaggart's argument that time's unreal. So basically it proceeds from three premises. Then there are two intermediate conclusions or lemmas, and then an overall conclusion. And those are set out on the handout. So premise one is... and we'll talk about the justification for these premises in a minute, but I'm just going to state them for now. So premise one is that there can be no time without change. Premise two, the A series is necessary for change. Premise three, the A series is contradictory. So intermediate conclusion or lemma one, which follows from premise three, the A series doesn't exist, right? This follows from premise three. The A series is contradictory because nothing that's contradictory presumably can exist. Then intermediate conclusion or lemma two, there's no change, right? So premise two says the A series is necessary for change. Lemma one says the A series doesn't exist. So it seems to follow deductively from premise 2 and lemma 1 that lemma 2 holds, there's no change. Then the overall conclusion, time doesn't exist, or in other words, time's unreal. This follows deductively from lemma 2 and premise 1. So premise 1 says there can be no time without change. Lemma 2 says there's no change. So seems to follow deductively that time doesn't exist. Okay, so before evaluating the premises, it appears that the argument's valid, deductively valid. That is to say, as those of you who've taken first order logic will know, hopefully, to say an argument's valid in this sense isn't to say anything about whether its premises are true. All we're saying so far is that if its premises are true, then it seems the conclusion must be true. It's deductively valid. Now, yeah, so I think most people have accepted that it's deductively valid. So rather the attention falls upon whether the premises are true. So sometimes logicians distinguish between soundness and validity. So an argument's valid if and only if the conclusion must be true if the premises are true, whereas it's sound if, in addition to being valid, the premises are indeed true. So what's Mctaggart's, first of all, before we look at ways we might reject the premises, it's reasonable to ask, well, what's Mctaggart's justification that he offers for the premises? When it comes to premise 1, actually he doesn't offer much justification. So he thinks it's more or less self-evident. So he thinks that a universe in which nothing at all changed would be a timeless universe. I guess it's important that one realizes that we're talking about really a universe in which nothing at all changes. So I think if you try to sort of imagine a changeless universe, it's natural to sort of imagine oneself in it or kind of viewing it. And you sort of imagine yourself in it, looking around you, not seeing anything happening, maybe getting a bit bored of waiting for something to happen. But it seems that's not a genuinely changeless universe, because even if nothing external to you is changing, at least your conscious thoughts are changing. So you're getting increasingly bored and so on. So that's not, even if we concede there would be time in such a universe, that wouldn't be a truly changeless universe, because something would be changing, namely the experiences of a conscious being. What Mctaggart's saying is a truly changeless universe would be timeless. So as I say, he thinks it's self-evident and maybe therefore doesn't offer an argument for it. Many people would accept this premise, but it's not entirely without controversy. And for those who are interested, there's a debate on its truth between Shoemaker and Le Poitevin, which is on the those two articles are on the further reading list for this week. Okay, so I guess many people are prepared to take premise 1 for granted, obviously Mctaggart included. So let's think about premise 2. So that says the A series is necessary for change. So Mctaggart's justification for this is that the B relations are permanent and unchanging. So he thinks it's only the A properties that could give us change, right? So otherwise, with only the permanent B relations, we'd have no change in the universe. So we need something that's genuinely changeable, namely the A properties. Okay, so you might sort of object. You might think, well, we don't need changeable A properties in order to give us some change in the universe. You might think, well, ordinary properties besides A properties could change. So you might say, well, look, an apple might go from being green to red to brown. Now, color properties are ordinary properties. They're not like weird A properties. But Mctaggart would have a response to this. So you might say, well, look, the change from green to red to brown is a genuine change of ordinary properties. That's enough for time, if time involves change. So what Mctaggart would say is that actually this change from green to red to brown is in fact nothing more than a change in A properties. So specifically, the green state of the apple goes from being present to past. The red state goes from being future to present to past, and the brown state goes from being future to present. So what's going on is explainable in terms of a change of A properties. Now, having said that, so that's Mctaggart's defense, this premise 2 is controversial. And as we'll see, it's rejected by a group of philosophers known as B theorists about time. So the B theorists agree with Mctaggart that the A series doesn't exist, but essentially they reject the notion that the existence of B relations is not enough for time. They think that B relations alone, even without the A properties or the A series, is enough to give us the existence of time. They differ from a group of philosophers known as, we'll talk about this more in a moment, known as A-theorists. A-theorists agree with Mctaggart that the A series is necessary for time. However, they disagree with him in his claim that the A series is contradictory and doesn't exist. So they think that the A series is necessary for time, and the A series exists. Okay. All right, so we'll come back more onto premise 2. What about premise 3? The A series is contradictory. Well, Mctaggart argues that, look, the A properties of pastness, presentness, and futureness are incompatible. So something can't be past, present, and future. But he says to suppose there is an A series is to suppose that every event has them all, right? Because think of World War II, right? So it started out by having the property of being future, then it had the property of being present, and then it had the property of being past. So it has all of these A properties, futureness, presentness, and pastness, even though Mctaggart says these properties are incompatible. So supposing that there is an A series, supposing that events have these properties, lands us in contradiction according to Mctaggart. So he thinks A properties, the supposition of A properties is incoherent or contradictory, so there can't be A properties, there can't be an A series. Now you might already think there's something fishy about Mctaggart's argument for premise 3. So Mctaggart is aware that plenty of people would find it fishy, and he himself discusses what he calls the natural objection to his argument for the contradictoriness of the A series. So the natural objection is to point out that although in a sense an event like World War II has the property of pastness, presentness, and futureness, it of course doesn't have these properties all at the same time. So the natural objection says, look, it doesn't have all these properties at the same time. And there would only be a contradiction if we were saying that World War II was past, present, and future all at the same time. So the natural objector says, well, what's rather the case is that, for instance, World War II is past, but there was a time when it was present, and there was another time when it was future. Now, Mctaggart takes on board this natural objection, but he argues it's not successful. Specifically, he argues that it involves some sort of circularity or regress, because he says it presupposes the existence of time in order to explain the compatibility of the A properties. So when I say, look, there's no contradiction in saying that the World War II has the properties of pastness, presentness, and futureness, I explain this by saying there's no contradiction because I'm not saying that it has them all at the same time. So there I'm presupposing the notion of time. So I might further expand, while it's now past, it was present, and at another time was future. So again, I'm presupposing time. I'm talking about now, what is the case, what was the case. So I'm using this tensed language that presupposes time. So Mctaggart's claim is that in lodging this natural objection to his argument, I'm taking time for granted, but this was what was at issue, right? So Mctaggart's arguing that time is unreal, and specifically that the A series is contradictory. So I can't, according to him, make free use of the notion of time, which is the very thing at issue, and which, according to him, presupposes the A series in order to show that the A series is coherent, because we're sort of begging the question. Now, most, as I said, people who call themselves A-theorists reject this premise 3 of Mctaggart's, that the A series is contradictory, and are normally not impressed by Mctaggart's response to the natural objection. So one sort of response that they make is to say, look, A properties are just basic or primitive, so you can't explain them or reduce them to anything else. So it's no wonder when you're trying to give an account of them, the account looks circular, or an account of their compatibility, the account looks circular. That's just kind of the nature of basic properties, right? You can't account for them in other terms. You can't reduce them to something else because they're basic. That's what it means to say that they're basic. So they'll argue something like, well, it's just a brute fact that it's consistent for an event to be present at one time and past, at another time and future, at another time. And it's perfectly legitimate to presuppose time in explaining how these are compatible, because time's just something basic. We couldn't hope to reduce it or the A series to something else. So I guess it might be helpful to think of analogies here. So you might have come across in your other philosophical studies various concepts besides time that philosophers have taken an interest in. So take something like knowledge or causation. So often philosophers will attempt to give accounts of concepts like knowledge in other terms. They'll attempt to reduce knowledge to something else. So this is the method of conceptual or metaphysical analysis, attempting to reduce one thing to something else. Roughly, the justification for it would be a kind of Occam's razor-like justification. So one wants to reduce the number of basic things that one has to posit. So if you can reduce knowledge to something that's something besides knowledge, then you don't have, or causation to something besides causation, or time to something besides time, then you don't have to posit these things as basic primitives in your theory, thus hopefully leading to a simplification of your theory. But, some things have to be basic. Not everything can be reduced, otherwise it would seem we have a regress. Now, the A-theorist is going to argue that time is one of these basic things. So, by analogy, someone might point to the problems that actually philosophers have had coming up with a successful reductive analysis of knowledge, and say, look, you can't give a successful reductive analysis of knowledge. If you give a successful analysis, then it ends up being a circular one, and any non-circular one is a failure. And so they might point to this as evidence that knowledge is basic. And so essentially the A-theorist is saying something similar with respect to time. Look, yeah, true, you can't provide a non-circular successful analysis, but that's just evidence that time is basic, not and doesn't reduce to something else. it's not evidence that it doesn't exist. Okay. So that's the sort of response that the A theorist will have to Mctaggart. And, we can think about whether we find it convincing or not. But just on with Mctaggart for a little bit longer. So let's just assume Mctaggart's right for now. Mctaggart thinks that actually, so Mctaggart, although he rejects the A series as incoherent, he's not a B theorist either, right? So, in fact, not only does he not think that the B series is enough for time, which B theorists do, but actually Mctaggart thinks the B series doesn't even exist. And basically his thought is that his reasoning is that he thinks that if the A series doesn't exist, then the B series can't exist either. And we've seen already that he rejects the A series. And that's because he thinks we need the A series to make the distinction between earlier than and later than. So earlier than and later than are different relations. Well, one's the flip side of the other. But, it's an asymmetric relation. So if A is earlier than B, then B is not also earlier than A, at least not normally. If A is earlier than B, then B is later than A. But he reckons that we can only make sense of this asymmetry by presupposing the A series. So what does it mean to say that A is earlier than B? Well, it must be that A is past and B is present, or it must be that B is future and A is present, or it must be that A is distant past and B is less distant past, or it must be that A is nearer future than B. So he thinks we can only understand the earlier than relation and how it differs from the later than relation if we invoke the A series, the A properties. Now, the B theorist will obviously resist this and will come back, especially in later lectures, to see how they might do so. Okay, so Mctaggart takes his conclusion to be the unreality of time, the non-existence of time. But it's worth being a bit careful about what Mctaggart actually takes his argument to show and what he doesn't take it to show. So he doesn't take it to show that there's no fourth dimension, right? So he doesn't take it to show that there couldn't be a dimension of the sort that we can label or represent using an axis labeled T in our space-time diagram. So he doesn't take it to show that reality is three-dimensional rather than four-dimensional. Rather, what Mctaggart's arguing is this fourth dimension doesn't have the characteristics that would make it something that we could properly call a temporal dimension. So specifically, it lacks the characteristics of direction and passage, right? Direct passage could come only, or the flow of time could only come, in other words, change could only come via the A series. Direction, on the face of it, looks like it might come from the B series, but actually Mctaggart's argued that the B series can't exist if the A series doesn't exist. So it looks like this fourth dimension would lack direction as well as passage or flow. So he's happy enough to allow that there might be a fourth dimension, but just that it doesn't count as a temporal dimension because it lacks the characteristics associated with our concept of time. Now, Mctaggart actually does indeed seem to believe that there is a fourth dimension, and he calls this the C series. So essentially, the C series is what's left of the B series when we strip away the distinctions of past and future. So the C series, which might be what we label T when we produce our axes in a Minkowski space-time diagram. So it's not temporal, it doesn't involve change. It's just an order, right? So, for instance, you can have orders like the order provided by the natural numbers 1, 2, 3, and so on, that have an order, but this order doesn't imply any change. Now, Mctaggart doesn't say much by way of positive account of what the C series is, just that it's sort of what's left over when you subtract time from the B series. But there are ways in which we might understand the C series. So we might understand the C series analogously to the way we understand the spatial dimension. So one possible way of getting a grip on what the C series is to appeal to a so-called betweenness relation. Betweenness doesn't seem to presuppose earlier than or later than relations. So, for instance, I can say that World War II is between World War I and the Vietnam War. I can say World War I is between the American Civil War and World War II without presupposing anything about which one happens earliest. So this betweenness relation, for instance, gives us this first ordering on a handout. So in this order, World War I's between the American Civil War and the Vietnam War. World War II is also between the American Civil War and the Vietnam War. World War II is also between World War I and the Vietnam War. And World War I's between the American Civil War and World War II, and so on. So we've got an ordering, but we haven't appealed to the asymmetric earlier than and later than relation. So there's nothing. This is just an ordering that gets the betweenness relations right, but there's nothing to privilege that first ordering over this ordering, right, which also gets the betweenness relations right. It's the reverse order essentially, and the reason that both orders we haven't got anything to choose between them is because we don't have an asymmetric relation like the earlier than later than relation. But there are some orderings that the betweenness relation or the facts about betweenness do rule out. So they rule out this order according to which the Vietnam War is between World War II and the American Civil War, and that's false. Okay, so that would give us some sense of what a C series is like. It's an order of events. It gives us a dimension, but it just doesn't give us an asymmetry, a distinction of past and future, which Mctaggart would take to be key to making it a temporal dimension. Okay, so now it seems that Mctaggart has a little bit of explaining to do because I think it seems to be the sort of notion that there's a genuinely temporal dimension in which there's passage or flow of time seems to be fairly embedded in our ordinary ways, well, seemingly in our ordinary experience of time and our ordinary ways of speaking of time and thinking about time. So how does Mctaggart explain that it seems to us as though there's a flow of time if there is no such thing? Well, Mctaggart argues essentially that our temporal experience is illusory, so it's not representing anything genuine. And he thinks that there's independent evidence of the illusoriness of our experience of time. So, in particular, he's going to argue that our experience of time just couldn't correspond to anything objective. And there's sort of various reasons for thinking this. So if we consider the so-called experiential present, what Mctaggart sometimes calls a specious present, the set of all things experienced as present, in other words, well, it's well known from psychological experimentation that the experiential present isn't an instant, but rather is an interval. So you get experiments that show this. So, for instance, if an experimenter has two sounds emitted at the same distance from a subject, with a short interval between them, then as measured, by some accurate clock, then the subject will experience those sounds as simultaneous. So that suggests that the experiential present is an interval rather than an instant. But surely then the experiential present couldn't correspond to an objective present. So if there were an objective present, it doesn't seem that it could be an interval. It seems it would have to be an instant or a point along the temporal dimension. So one reason for this was provided by the medieval philosopher St. Augustine, who says that if we suppose that the present is an interval, then that means that the present could have earlier and later parts, with the later parts lying in the future of the earlier parts. But that doesn't seem to make any sense. That seems to contradict the very notion of a present, the fact that it should be divided into earlier and later parts. That just doesn't seem to be what's meant by the present. And it's also been shown that the experiential present isn't a constant interval, actually. So there are circumstances in which you can make more fine-grained temporal distinctions than others. So actually, people often point out that when they're in danger, then time seems to slow right down. And so arguably what's going on there is they're experiencing finer-grained distinctions in time. This arguably serves some sort of evolutionary or survival function, because the finer-grained your perceptions of time, the more able you are to react quickly to events occurring in time. So you might or might not have experienced this, but often in dangerous situations, this is what people report. And there's some actual experimental psychological evidence to back this up. So, that we've got various reasons. I mean, you actually also can get time order reversal phenomena, so that if one sound is emitted before another sound, each at the same distance from a subject, then in some circumstances the subject will experience the earlier sound later and the later sound earlier. So that's even weirder. So that these sorts of arguments seem to show that the experiential presence doesn't really seem to track anything that could be objective. So you might think, well, so sort of arguments on the basis of our experience for an objective present look a bit flawed. However, this is not a sort of irresistible line of argument by Mctaggart, because you might say, well, for instance, aren't we sort of presupposing that we know what the objective present is, or what objective time is, even in setting these experiments up? So, for instance, in order to show experiential time reversal or time dilation, it involves, for instance, sending out sounds from a distance to a subject and measuring the time that elapses in between the emission of the sounds. That suggests that we have a way of determining how much time has elapsed, and measuring these in fine-grained ways that don't rely on just straightforward experience. So maybe we have other ways of making sense of an objective present. Okay. So there's some debate over that. So let's think a bit more now about the A theory and the B theory. So, as I've said, most philosophers reject Mctaggart's argument, but they reject it for different reasons. So the A theorist will reject premise 3, the notion that the A series is contradictory, and we'll take the to be genuine A properties, and normally we'll explain the passage of time in terms of changes in the A properties. So they'll take the passage of time to be real and objective and not merely an illusion. And normally, as I've suggested, they'll take the A properties to be somehow fundamental or basic features of the world, not reducible to anything else. On the other hand, the B theorists side with Mctaggart to the extent that they reject the A series, and many of them reject. Well, there are various. We'll come back to why they reject it. There are various reasons, in fact, beyond Mctaggart's reasons why you might reject it. But they think that B properties exist. They think that we can have B properties without the A series, and they think that B properties are enough for change and therefore for time. So basically what they need is, in order to have B relations without A properties, is they need some other way of accounting for the asymmetry of time. So there are various ways that physicists and philosophers have sought to do that. One appeals, and we'll talk about this more later in term, appeals to thermodynamics. So what's known as the Second Law of Thermodynamics seems to give us an asymmetry, a physical asymmetry along the fourth dimension. And so you might try to understand B relations in terms of that physical asymmetry without relying on A properties. Now, B, as I say, we'll come back to that later in term. B theorists will still want to make sense of the fact that we ordinarily talk about pastness, presentness, and futureness. This seems to be a very common feature of our everyday talk and thought. So they want to make sense of it, but they want to do so without invoking A properties. So the way in which they do this is to treat such talk as a type of indexical talk. So what's an indexical? An indexical is a word or a phrase that, roughly speaking, as written on a piece of paper, doesn't have a determinate meaning, but rather it relies upon a context of utterance to determine its meaning. So classic examples of indexicals are words like I, right? So if Luke Fenton-Glynn utters the word I, then it refers to Luke Fenton-Glynn. if Joe Biden utters the word I, then it doesn't refer to Luke Fenton-Glynn, it refers to Joe Biden. So I is an example of an indexical expression. Spatial expressions like here and 1 mile away are indexicals. So if I utter the word here, then that refers, as it's uttered by me now, it refers to a particular location in Cambridge. Whereas any of you might utter the word here and certainly don't refer to the exact same location. And presumably these locations that are referred to are in different parts of the world. So the B theorist will say that temporal expressions are indexicals, just like spatial expressions. So, for instance, if someone utters the sentence World War II is past, that's going to report, according to them, the B series fact. Oops, I've changed my example. So that would report the B series fact that World War II is earlier than the time we're speaking. So if I now say World War II is past, then I say something true, because World War II is earlier than the time of the utterance of the sentence. Whereas if Abraham Lincoln said World War II is past, he would speak falsely, because any time he could have uttered that sentence, given that he lived before World War II, any time he could have uttered that sentence, World War II would have lain in the future rather than the past of the time of utterance. So this is a way of making sense of our talk of past, present, and future without taking there to be sort of fundamental, irreducible properties of pastness, presentness, and futureness. Rather, we just reduce it to a relation between the time of utterance and the time of the event in question. In other words, a B relation. Okay, so what about evaluating some of these theories? So, A theorists typically object to the B theory on the basis that, the B, kind of similarly to Mctaggart's objection, really. So they'll argue that the B series, because it just invokes these permanent temporal relations of earlier than, later than, simultaneous with, during, and so on, it doesn't give us change. It doesn't give us any change. But the A theorist is normally likely to agree with Mctaggart that change is essential for time. But there are also objections to the A theory, and objections that go beyond Mctaggart. So even if we grant that the A series isn't contradictory, there are still issues. So for the A theorist, time genuinely passes. There's an objective passage of time which corresponds to the change from futureness to presentness to pastness. But you might think, well, if time passes, then there must be some rate at which it passes. But you might think, well, any answer to the question about what rate it passes at seems absurd. So how would you answer the question of what rate or how fast does time pass? You might say 1 hour per hour, but that sort of seems absurd or trivial. You can't really give a substantive, sensible answer. In particular, it might seem that you need a reference point external to time itself in order to measure time with, in order to give a sensible answer. So maybe if you had two or more streams of time, then you could measure the rate of passage of one stream of time with respect to the other, just as if you have two clocks, you could measure how long it takes a minute to elapse on one clock, but according to the other clock. But as far as we know, nothing like that is true. There just seems to be the one stream of time. Next week, we're going to consider another objection to the A theory. And this is the objection that the special theory of relativity seems to imply that there's no absolute simultaneity. So that's something we've already seen when we covered special relativity. But this seems to pose a problem for the A-theorist, because the A-theorist believes that there's an objective present, a set of events that possess the property of being present at any one time. But what exactly is the present supposed to be? Well, presumably, if two events are present, then they're going to be simultaneous with one another. That just seems to be part of the notion of what it is to be present, right? It's a set of simultaneous events that's somehow privileged by this property of presentness. But the problem is that STR doesn't give us an absolute relation of simultaneity. It suggests that simultaneity is frame relative. In other words, it's relativized to a velocity. But it sort of would be kind of puzzling if presentness were relativized to a velocity, if we're A-theorists and we think that presentness is somehow an important absolute metaphysical fact. There are absolute metaphysical facts about what's present. It would be strange to say, there is this sort of fundamental feature of the world, the possession of presentness by a set of events, and yet also be relativist about this, in the sense of saying, well, what counts as present depends on one's frame of reference. So that's a puzzle for the A-theorist. Okay, so finally, so we've seen a bit about the debate between the A-theorist and the B-theorist, and Mctaggart. There's also another sort of debate that's worth introducing about that has to do with time, a metaphysical debate about time. And that is the debate between so-called presentists, eternalists, and growing universe theorists. So the A theory and B theory might be thought of different theories of the nature of time, whereas presentism, eternalism, and the growing universe theory are kind of different theories about what exists in time. So according to presentism, only present objects exist. So according to them, Aristotle, World War One, the year 2018 don't exist. So these are past and so don't exist. My great-great-grandchildren don't exist. I put the year 2020 in. That shows this handout's a bit out of date. That should be, say, 2022. The inauguration of the 47th President of the United States. Those things don't exist because they're future. So presentist denies that the past and future exists. Eternalists think that, as the name suggests, as well as the present, also the past and the future exist. And finally, the growing universe theorists think that past and present exist, but future doesn't exist. Right. So three views: presentist, only the present exists; growing universe theory, past and present exists, but the future doesn't exist; eternalism, all three exist. So past, present, and future all exist. Now, I suppose you might have a shrinking universe theory, according to which the future and the present exist, but the past doesn't. But as far as I know, no one seriously endorses that theory. The reason the growing universe theory is more popular than a shrinking universe theory is because it's supposed to capture the idea that the past is settled, and maybe the present's settled too, but the future's open, right? So it captures that intuition by saying that the past and present exist, but the future doesn't. So the future is open in a metaphysical sense. It doesn't exist. It doesn't yet exist. Okay, so these are theories that we'll have a bit more time to talk about later in term, but we'll give some at least initial thoughts about them. So an initial objection to eternalism, and an objection that actually also applies to growing universe theory, is that it sounds odd to say that dinosaurs exist. Or in other words, there are some dinosaurs. Seems to be logically equivalent. And when it comes to eternalism, but not growing universe theory, it sounds odd to say that my great-great-grandchildren exist. Now, so yeah, that does seem odd. Now, the eternalists, the way they'll respond is to say that this oddity has to do with so-called quantifier restrictions. So X exists is an example of a quantifier, existential quantification. It's saying there are some X's. So there are some great-great-grandchildren of mine, or there are some dinosaurs. Now, the idea is that actually the domain of quantification, so will vary across contexts. So, often there are kind of implicit restrictions on the domain of quantification. So when we evaluate existentially quantified claims, sometimes restrictions are in place. So consider the following scenario. Suppose that my wife and I are in a busy car park. We're looking for somewhere to park. My wife's driving, and I'm supposed to be looking for parking spaces, and we can't find one. And I say something like, "Well, there is a parking space." Still my wife can't see this parking space, and I say, well, all I meant was there is somewhere in the entire universe a parking space. Well, my wife would be justifiably annoyed with me if I said that, because the natural interpretation of what I was saying wasn't that there's a parking space somewhere in the universe. The natural interpretation was there's a parking space somewhere in this car park. So the idea is that in that context, there was a sort of natural domain restriction. So specifically to something like objects in this car park. So when I said there is a parking space, it was natural to understand that existential quantifier as referring to a domain of things in this car park. So the eternalist is going to say, when I say there are dinosaurs, the oddity of saying that is explained similarly. So ordinarily, if you say, there is something exists, you're understood as talking about the domain of objects that constitutes the present, right? So if I say there are dinosaurs, it would be natural to understand me as saying there are dinosaurs in the present. But the eternalist is just going to say, well, this is quantification of a restricted domain. If we lift that restriction and we truly talk about all of reality, well, then the claim that there are dinosaurs somewhere in reality is true. It's just that reality extends into the past and the future. Okay, so they think they can explain why it might sometimes sound weird to say there are dinosaurs, even if it's true. Okay, so that's all we'll say for now about eternalism. We'll have a bit more to say about it later in term. What about the growing universe theory? So actually, interestingly, the growing universe theory faces an objection that's somewhat analogous to the A theory. So remember, the A theory faced this objection that said, well, if time genuinely passes, then there must be some fact about the rate at which it passes. But the answers that we can give all seem to be kind of odd or trivial or nonsensical. Likewise, with the growing universe theory, you might say, well, if the universe is growing, there must be some rate at which it's growing. But again, answers to the rate question seem somehow odd or trivial or nonsensical. So what do you say? The universe is growing at an hour per hour or a trillion objects an hour? It seems these answers somehow strike us as slightly odd answers and unsatisfactory. So there are some sort of causes for a potential reservation about the growing universe theory. We'll come back to some more later in term. What about presentism? Well, there are sort of various sorts of objections that have been made to presentism. I guess like presentists tend to market their view as being the most intuitive one. So maybe that's why people have felt more need to come up with a bunch of objections to presentism than to eternalism. They might have thought, well, the counterintuitivity of eternalism is already enough. So one sort of objection to presentism is an objection from causation. So consider a claim which seems to be true, that Biden's election victory caused him to be the US president. However, according to the presentist, because Biden's election victory was in the past, it doesn't exist, right? So then there's a question about how this claim can be true. How can it be true that Biden's election victory caused him to be president if Biden's election victory doesn't exist? How can something that doesn't exist cause something that does exist? Quite similarly, there's an objection from reference. So if I say Shakespeare was a playwright, then how can we make that seems to be true, but how can we make sense of its truth on a presentist picture? Because after all, on the presentist picture, Shakespeare doesn't exist, right? Because he doesn't live in the present. So what can I possibly mean in saying that Shakespeare was a playwright? How can that possibly be true if Shakespeare doesn't exist? And finally, when it comes to presentism, there's, as you might expect, an objection, and again, this is something we'll look at next week in more detail, from the special theory of relativity. So the A theory suffered a sort of related objection, but this afflicts presentism too. So according to the special theory of relativity, there's no absolute simultaneity. Simultaneity is frame relative, in other words, velocity dependent. And so, when we think about what the present is meant to be, presumably it's a set of points or events that's all simultaneous with one another, and somehow special. So it's not just any old simultaneous set of points, but it's the present one which exists. But then, because simultaneity is frame relative, that makes presentness look frame relative. But you might think, well, it's just implausible or bizarre to say that what exists is frame relative or relative to a velocity. Okay, so as I say, this is sort of set up for what will come later in term. We'll touch again on these themes as we go on, but that's all we've got time for this week. So hope you have a good week, and I'll see some of you in the seminars. Okay, bye.